Those who knew someone who went missing, what happened? Story 1. My great-grandfather disappeared when his youngest child, my grandfather, was a toddler. Records were finally found decades later, showing he had moved across the county, changed his name, remarried, and had additional kids. Story 2. I went to the same elementary school as Michael Dunahee. He was kidnapped off the playground and still not found to this day. I remember after it happened, every parent showed up to walk the entire school of kids home. I also remember running ahead of the pack for whatever reason, and all the parents were screaming at me to get back. They were terrified. Story 3. My cousin, who I barely knew, disappeared along with his car, leaving behind a large blood stain in his apartment. Right from the start, his roommates were suspects, but several years passed and his body was still missing. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries or America's Most Wanted or one of those, and a tip came in giving the location of his car in a nearby river. His body was found in the trunk, and the roommates confessed and went to prison. Story 4. Debbie Moberg, age 16. The first story was that she ran away, but the stepdad couldn't keep his story straight. 2 days later, they talked to her 7-year-old sister, who reported the stepdad carrying her out of the house wrapped in a blanket. He actually took the little sister with to dump the body. It took 3 months of jail before he confessed to murdering her. He had been molesting her for years. She stood up to him when he shifted to the little sister. He had put her body in a commercial dumpster, which in turn was emptied at the city landfill. Landfill personnel did spend several weeks combing the area. They actually keep records of where things are dumped when, but no luck. So her last place is sort of known, but her body never properly found. Story 5. A childhood family friend had a head injury from a BMX accident and was most likely suffering from concussion or post-concussion symptoms. Went off into the wilderness, and his remains were found 3 years later. His dad spearheaded the search effort during those years. I think overall, not knowing exactly what happened was hard, but finding his remains and getting to bring them home was really great closure. Story 6. My brother's middle school teacher. He just didn't show up to school one day, which was very unusual. The school scrambled to find a substitute for him because they had no notice. We had a whole school meeting like 2 days later when he was officially missing, where they told us all about it. He left the house that morning as usual, according to his wife later said. He was never seen again. Many search parties were organized, and people looked for months, but they never found him. He is still officially missing today. Story 7. My best friend vanished on her way to her early morning work shift several years ago. Her van was found abandoned in a field, and she never was found despite the massive search response, SND the fact her family were all cops. There's also been some rumors about her stepmother interfering with evidence, but aside from that, it's been radio silent. The FBI was involved, last I heard. 3 days after she vanished, I had a dream about her. She said goodbye to me and told me that she loved me, and since then, I've known in my heart she's dead. I miss you, Sarah. Story 8. When I was a kid, a friend of mine was kidnapped by his dad. The mom got custody and the dad just showed up one day and took him. It was devastating for everyone, especially the mom and brother. Yeah, IDKY, he only took one kid. After about 5 years of police investigations, and the mom having to change her legal name and go into hiding, they finally found him and got him back home. He was safe, but he was really quiet for a few years after he got back. I have no idea what happened during that time. What I do know is that he seems incredibly well adjusted now, and last I heard he's happily married. Story 9. A neighbor's son vanished while jogging in our neighborhood. He was an avid runner, and it was unlike him to not come back on time. Days turned into a frantic search involving the entire community. Unfortunately, his body was found in a nearby river. An investigation revealed he had been struck by a hit-and-run driver and his body was dumped to hide the crime. The perpetrator was eventually caught, but it was a devastating loss for his family. Story 10. Guy I went to school with and kind of grew up around, his mom is one of my mom's best friends, went missing in 2010 on his way home. Police and search parties searched everywhere looking for him and his truck. He had to pass over a bridge to get to his house, so it should be noted that the lakes were searched by divers, and dragging the lake as well. 4 years later, 2014, the water levels were very low and someone called in saying they saw a tire sticking out of the surface of the water near the bridge. He would have had to cross to get home. It was him and his truck. At least the family got some closure after 4 long, excruciating years. Story 11. One of my best friends from childhood, her boyfriend and his friend set fire to her parents' house one night with her parents tied up inside. Luckily, they escaped, but she wound up missing for weeks. So many people were slinging accusations that she was in on it, but I, and others who really knew her, knew it just wasn't possible. I feared for the worst, but hoped for the best. Eventually, they found her body in the woods. Her boyfriend had shot her point blank with a shotgun before he and his friend went to her parents' house. I'm still not clear on the entire motivation. I know he was an addict, and her parents were trying to get her away from him. She was not an addict, and they didn't want her going down that path. And I know he had previously been abusive, but I have no idea still what the final motivating factor was for him to do this. He and his friend are now in prison, and I hope they never see the light of day again. Story 12. It's not someone I'm close to, but a guy I grew up with went missing from a music festival he was working at. Someone, or multiple people, told police that he abruptly told them he was going home. He didn't go home, he just disappeared. He got to the festival on a bike, but his bike was still there. A couple weeks later, he was identified as being a corpse found in a burned-out building the other direction from home. The case remains unsolved, but it is considered a homicide. The part about this case that bothers me is that I don't know whether the "he went home" person is telling the truth. Did he abruptly decide to go home because something scary happened, and he just didn't get that far? Or was that person the one who put him in that burned-out building? I just kind of feel like if things were that bad that he'd randomly say, "I'm quitting," and heading home. He'd just hop on his bike right then and there versus doing whatever came next that put him in the path of the people he was avoiding. Story 13. About 8 years ago, was at a bar with my university roommate around midnight. A guy I don't recognize comes up to my roommate. They exchange some words and give each other a big hug. Turns out they were old childhood friends. He sticks around and we shoot the shit for an hour or so. Super nice dude. Said he had to go meet some people, but if we're still out, he might come back this way. We stay for a couple more hours. He never comes back, and we head home. Around 2 weeks later, my roommate finds out via Facebook he went missing that night, and they found his body dumped in a storm drain a few days later. It's still kind of surreal typing this out now that we were maybe some of the last people he talked to. They did catch the people that did it, though, so that was good at least. Story 14. My uncle drove my cousins all the way across the country to visit my grandma, but then just up and left without his children. A couple days after arriving and then disappeared for several years. Come to find out, he had moved to the Philippines and started a brand new family over there with his brand new Filipino wife. He still won't talk to any of us, including his own children, even though we've tried contacting him several times throughout the years after he showed back up on Facebook. Douchebag. Story 15. Not me, but a poor old guy at Costco. This old guy, maybe late 60s, came up to me and said, "Jimmy," I think that's the name he said. "Is that you?" I said no. His face sank. I talked to him for a bit. Apparently his adult grandson Jimmy vanished a few years before, and I looked just like him. He said the family had no idea where he is and hadn't seen him in years. He just up and moved away without telling anyone. The guy didn't seem like he had dementia or anything. Just a grandfather looking for his grandson. This was a few years ago. I felt really bad for the guy. His heart probably got super excited only to be broken again when I wasn't Jimmy. I hope Jimmy eventually contacted his family because his grandfather seemed really sad about it. Story 16. I worked with a young woman named Julie. She had a little girl and was in the process of splitting from her husband. She didn't show up for work one day, a no-call, no-show. She was missing from that day forward. The ex had their daughter and had logged into her FB to make a message about leaving town with a new boyfriend. They found her car abandoned in a parking lot. The ex went on Dr. Phil, I believe, to do a lie detector test and proclaim innocence. Even though they have never found her body, the ex was actually found guilty of her murder. Sometimes I think about her and wonder where her earthly remains are. I hope she is found someday and her family gets to bury her. Story 17. A girl from my graduating class in high school went missing 10 years ago. She had 2 kids and just was gone one day. She's still missing, so I really can't answer what happened. Her family, law enforcement, and the greater community have looked for her tirelessly. I hope we get answers one day. Story 18. A dependable client of mine didn't show up to an appointment, and we couldn't get a hold of her, so we charged her half of her service fee as per our company's policy. The next time I saw her, she apologized profusely and said she was in a diabetic coma and couldn't come to her appointment. We refunded her, obviously. Story 19. My stepsister went missing about a year after my stepdad married my mom. We had just moved into our new house a couple states away from where I grew up, and I didn't know anybody. My stepsister was 3 years older and helped me make friends at school. We lived about a mile from school and walked there and back a couple days a week when my mom had to go to work early. One day, I walked back home from school alone because my stepsister had basketball practice. There had been some robberies in the area, so my mom had us carry pepper spray with us, and I remember feeling weird that day. I got home fine, and a few hours later, we hadn't heard from my stepsister, so my stepdad called the basketball coach to see if practice went late. We didn't have phones. The coach said my stepsister had left the school a couple hours before. A few months later, after a lot of searching, her body was found in the woods near the school. There was pepper spray residue all over her skin. They never caught the person who did it, but she was killed with the rock the police found near her body. Story 20. Around July of 2022, an old high school classmate of mine went missing. She was a mother of 2 boys, one of them with special needs. The last known contact she had with anyone was when she told a friend of hers she was going to the store, but she never returned. The police were informed, and a missing persons report was filed. Her phone and wallet were found at her home. A boyfriend she was dating was questioned and released without any indication of foul play. She's never been seen or heard from since. Story 21. I met Elizabeth Smart after she returned home after being kidnapped. We were both playing in the school orchestra for a musical, and her harp was set up near my drum set. We talked a few times, normally just about the music, and I never said a word about her ordeal. She was very nice and also very serious/professional about doing a good job in the ensemble. I hope she's doing well out there. Story 22. My town is small, in the mountains of the Appalachian Mountains for some context. Everyone knows everyone, so when someone goes missing, you notice. First was a lady that friends with my mom. Let's call her M. She owned and operated a sandwich shop. My mom was working for her and helping her out at the time. One day, she just didn't come to work. Her husband showed up instead. Day 2, she didn't show up. She wasn't answering calls, and her husband was telling everyone she left town suddenly. Ran away. My mom didn't believe him and reported her missing. 2 or 3 days later, her body was found in a well at their camp residence. Her husband killed her and hid her body in the well because he was caught having an affair. He's in prison for the rest of his life. Second person is basically the same thing, only she was never found. Her boyfriend is the #1 suspect, but her body has never been found, and he's still walking the streets. Story 23. I had a buddy in college I will refer to here as Ned. He was a super fun guy, a bit brash, but overall someone who had your back and wanted what was best for all his friends. After college, we continued to correspond weekly and still meet up every few months. However, once I moved away from the area, our contact became less for about 2 years. When we did talk, he was much ruder and angrier. We started talking less. Then he suddenly wanted to talk again and confessed his life had been falling apart. Drug use, which led to his relationship failing, which led to getting fired from his job. He told me he had fought to get clean and now was, and wanted to apologize for how he acted. I forgave him and wished him well and asked how I could help. He said just listening to him was enough. Another few years after that, Ned called me to tell me he was visiting the city where I lived. I met up with Ned at a bar and had a great time catching up. That was the last time I saw Ned. A few months after that, I texted him and never got a reply, which was odd, since he usually was great in replying. I waited another month and tried again. Still no reply. Wondering if he changed his number, I tried via social media. Nothing. I got worried and contacted our admittedly few mutual friends. I realized I was the last one to see him. To this day, now, almost a decade later, I have no idea what happened to Ned. He has never updated his social media since shortly after I last saw him. Attempts to Google him have turned up nothing. None of our mutual friends have heard either. Part of me believes he just decided to start over and has a good life on his own. But another part of me fears he fell back into drugs, and that may have killed him. Story 24. A not-so-close friend in the group of people I played Magic the Gathering with. Really cool guy. Worked as a climbing instructor and would occasionally drink too much rum and try to climb my roof from unlikely directions. One Wednesday evening he was supposed to come over for some magic, and he just didn't. He didn't answer his phone, no reply on WhatsApp or on Facebook Messenger. We knew that he had broken his arm the previous week and was resting at home, so the number of possible scenarios was extremely limited. He lived in a different city, none of us knew how to contact his roommates, and his family was all on the other side of the world. He showed up again 4 years later. I still don't know the full story, but as far as I can tell, he'd been an alcoholic for some time. He tried to harm himself that day and was involuntarily hospitalized for 2.5 years and couldn't contact the outside world. And afterwards he was moved to some rehab and still couldn't contact the outside world. Pretty terrifying fate, to be honest. On the bright side, he's still a really cool guy even without any rum. Story 25. My cousin ran away when he was 16 years old. 1976. He learned how to get a new identity by watching a 60 Minutes US episode. I did searches from time to time during the early days of the internet, way before Google. One day his name popped up. I called the number, but the person did not know who or what I was talking about. I mentioned that I was his cousin and left my name and phone number. A couple of days later, he called me. Good conversation. With my cousin's permission, I reached out to his brother and dad. They all had hours-long conversations, and we all had a nice family reunion. My cousin had an interesting life and passed away last year. Story 26. A friend of my mother's went on a camping trip alone with her male best friend. They were both retirees, both married to other people, so when they didn't come back, people thought they may have eloped. A few other people had gone missing in the area, though, so a homeless guy called the Button Man was questioned. Turns out he hadn't done anything, he was just a harmless bushie, and another man was arrested for their murder.